Montana Territory, March of 1873. The ice cracked before she plunged, and for a second, all she could see was white sky and his face. Then the river swallowed her. Her name was Josephine Barnes, and she did not scream. The cold ripped every sound straight from her throat. Water slammed her into the rocks beneath the surface, and her hands clawed for anything: roots, branches, solid ground, but the current tore her downstream like she weighed nothing. She had not meant to fall. That part was clear. One misstep on the icy riverbank after chasing a runaway colt, and now her boots were gone, her breath was gone, and she was going to die alone in the river until a man leapt in after her. He had not hesitated. She'd glimpsed him on the ridge moments before, tall and fast-moving, coat flying behind him as he sprinted toward the churning water. He had shouted something, but the river was too loud. And then he was there, arms around her, dragging her up through blackness and cold, his voice breaking through the roar. "I've got you," he said, voice rough with effort. "You're safe. I've got you." He hauled her ashore, half carrying, half dragging her over the rocks until they fell into the snow together, breathless. Josephine coughed, sputtered, and curled into herself, shivering so hard her teeth scraped together. "Stay with me," he said, crouched beside her. "I need to get those wet clothes off you, you'll freeze." She looked up, eyes unfocused, lips blue. "Who? Harlan Dorsey saw you fall." He was already shrugging off his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Do you have a camp nearby?" She nodded weakly. "Sea cabin, half-mile." "That direction." Harlan lifted her like she weighed nothing, her soaked body pressed against his chest. She could hear his heart pounding through his shirt. His jaw was clenched tight and snow stuck to his dark hair and brows. He smelled like pine smoke and wind. "Hang on, Josephine." He said her name like he already knew it. "You're going to be all right." The walk to the cabin was brutal. Her body shook uncontrollably, but she clung to him. She barely remembered unlocking the door or the way he kicked it shut behind them. But she remembered how gentle his hands were. He got the stove lit fast, found the dry wool blanket hanging on the wall and wrapped her in it, then knelt to unlace her frozen boots. She tried to help, but her fingers felt numb and useless. "You're going to need dry clothes," he said. "Where?" "Trunk, by the bed." He moved fast. She saw the muscles in his shoulders flex as he opened the trunk and pulled out a flannel nightdress. He turned his back as she changed, but stayed close, his silhouette tense in the firelight. When she was dry and bundled again, he helped her sit near the stove. "Drink this," he said, handing her a tin cup of hot water. "I'll make something stronger once you're warmer." She took it, hands trembling. "You jumped in after me. You were going under," he said simply. "Didn't think about it." "Most people wouldn't have," she whispered, his eyes met hers. "Most people didn't see you." They sat in silence for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside the cabin it was warm and Josephine's shivers began to ease. Her fingers curled around the tin cup. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. "South Ridge." Just passing through this stretch scouting game, was not expecting to see a woman fall into the river. "Lucky for me that you did." Harlan gave a small nod, almost like he did not know what to say to that. His face was strong, not handsome in the polished way, but solid. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them now, something quiet and watchful. Josephine looked away first. "I take care of this place alone." "My father passed last spring." "I'm sorry," she shrugged, though her throat tightened. "He taught me how to hunt, trap, mend fences, said no man would ever be able to cheat me if I knew how to survive. He was right. I try to believe that." They sat together in the small warmth of the cabin. Snow pressed at the windows, but inside it was safe. And for the first time in weeks, Josephine felt like she could breathe. Harlan stayed the night at her insistence. The storm had worsened, and it would have been foolish to ride out in it. He took the floor near the stove, stretched out under his own coat and a spare blanket. She lay in the bed, eyes open in the dark, listening to his steady breathing. "Thank you," she said into the quiet. His voice came soft from the shadows. "You are welcome." She closed her eyes. By morning, the snow had stopped. Pale light spilled through the frosted windows. When Josephine stepped outside, wrapped in her shawl, she found Harlan already splitting kindling, sleeves rolled, breath curling in the cold. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he answered. "But I want to." She watched him for a moment. There was something steady about him. Not just in the way he split wood, but in the way he moved, the way he looked at her like she was not a burden to be dealt with, but something worth being there for. "You planning to keep riding west?" she asked later, once the fire was stoked and coffee boiled on the stove. "I was," he said. "Still might." But he did not leave that day or the next. A week passed, and he helped mend the chicken wire, brought in water, fixed the back gate that had been leaning since October. They fell into a rhythm, quiet and easy. One night after supper, Josephine stepped out onto the porch. The stars were sharp above the trees, and the cold bit clean through her shawl. She felt him come out behind her. "Are you staying?" she asked. Harlan stepped beside her, eyes on the sky. "If you want me to." She looked at him then. Really looked. At the man who had pulled her from the river, who had not let go. Who had not pushed or asked or expected anything of her, just stayed steady and sure. "I do," she said. He turned toward her and his hand found hers. "Then I will stay." The thaw came slow that year. April brought slush and mud, and the river swelled with meltwater, running fast and thick with broken ice. Josephine kept a wary eye on it, though the banks near the cabin had held. The trees dripped constantly and the yard turned soft underfoot, but the worst of winter had passed. Harlan stayed. He didn't offer reasons, and she didn't ask for them. He took to the woods at first light most mornings, returning by dusk with rabbits or duck or once, a young elk, shoulders bowed under the weight of it. He tanned its hide without being asked, strung it out behind the shed, and let her keep the best strips for jerky. Josephine worked beside him, though she never lost the awareness of him, his nearness, the way he moved with quiet certainty, how he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with hunger, but with something steadier, like he was learning her, waiting for her to see something he already had. One afternoon, while she was rinsing clothes in the basin behind the cabin, she heard the creak of leather and turned to find him leading a dapple gray packhorse down the slope, a canvas sack tied behind the saddle. "You ride out?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Into town," he said. 3-day ride, needed salt, new traps, thought you might want something." She blinked. "You didn't ask." "I figured if I waited for you to ask, you wouldn't." He untied the sack and handed it to her. Inside was a bolt of soft calico, dark blue with sprigs of white along the hem. She ran her fingers across it, then looked up. "I haven't sewn a new dress in over a year." "I know." She folded the fabric carefully. "Did you see anyone?" "Storekeep in Helena. A man asked if I was kin to the Dorseys from Bozeman." "That was it." She nodded, unsure why her heart had picked up in her chest. Later, after supper, she stood by the window, watching a pair of mourning doves settle into the bare-limbed cottonwood. Harlan sat at the table behind her, sharpening his belt knife with long, slow strokes. "Did you ever marry?" she asked. He didn't pause in his motion. "No, why not?" "I was gone too long. Army, then freighting for a while. By the time I came back, the girl I'd meant to ask had married my cousin." Josephine turned from the window. "Did that break something in you?" He looked up. "No, but it made me careful." She came to the table and sank into the chair across from him. The blade flashed in his hand, edge catching the firelight. "I don't know how to be soft with someone," she said. "You don't have to be." "I mean, I don't know how to let someone stay." He set the knife down. "Then let me show you how." She looked at him across the table. "I don't want to owe you, you won't. I'm not easy. I'm not asking for easy." He reached for her hand then, slow, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm. She stared down at their joined hands for a long time before speaking again. "Can you build with logs?" "I can. The north wall's sagging. If you're staying, you might as well help fix it." His thumb brushed the back of her hand. "I was hoping you'd say that." They slept in separate spaces still. He never crossed the line she hadn't named but still held. But the space between them was shrinking. A week later, they took down the north wall together, stacking the rotted logs and hauling new timber from the slope above the hollow. He cut the notches clean, she shoveled the foundation clear, and they fitted the new beams in silence, sweat cooling under their collars. That night she found him outside, seated on the porch step, pipe in hand, watching the moon rise over the hills. She sat beside him, knees brushing. "I miss the sound of a fiddle sometimes," she said. "My father used to play one bad as thunder. You sing, not since he passed." He didn't press her, just sat with her under the stars, smoke curling slow from his pipe. She leaned her shoulder into his and he let her. When she finally reached for his hand again, he closed his around hers without a word. She didn't say she trusted him, and he didn't ask. But that night, when she left the door to her room unlatched, he didn't come through it. He just sat up a little longer, watching the woods and listening to the wind in the trees, as if that was enough. By late May, the woods had softened. New grass pushed through last year's deadfall, and the birches near the creek wore a pale shimmer of green. Josephine moved easier now, her steps lighter as the land warmed beneath her boots. She'd taken to walking the fence-line in the early hours, checking for breaks, keeping her hands busy with wire and hammer, though she knew the ground better than her own reflection. That morning she found Harlan down by the lower field, crouched beside a broken axle from the old seed cart. He had a cloth wrapped around his wrist, stained dark at the edge. "What happened?" she asked, dropping beside him. "Splinter caught me," he said, not looking up. She pulled the cloth back. "That's more than a splinter. Beam cracked when I lifted it, caught my arm on the way down." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Get up, I'll clean it." He didn't argue. Back at the cabin, she boiled water, ground yarrow, and motioned him to sit at the table. He did, arm stretched across the wood, jaw tight. "You always work through pain," he watched her tie the bandage. "There's never been much use in waiting for it to go. There's use in not making it worse." He gave a single nod, quiet settling between them. She dipped the cloth again, pressed it gently to the wound. "You ever think of leaving Montana?" she asked. "Once, after my father died. I made it as far as the Idaho line, then turned around." "Why?" "No reason that made sense then, might now." She tied the final knot, set the cloth aside. "I used to think I'd go east. Maybe Helena, teach children letters, but I don't know that I'd manage well in a place with polished floors." He glanced up. "You wouldn't like the way they look at you." "I've seen enough eyes go cold to know when I don't belong. You belong here." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the tin of coffee grounds, set the pot to boil again. He watched her move, his gaze steady, quiet. "I built a life around silence," she said finally. "It's what held me together after my father passed. I don't mind silence." "That's not what I mean." "I mean I made myself into someone who didn't need anyone stepping through the door." "You say that like it's still true." She turned then, her hand resting on the edge of the stove. "Maybe it's not." He stood, the chair legs scraping soft against the floorboards. "I won't ask you to change anything, I know. I won't ask you to be anything different than what you are." She looked at him then, truly looked. There were lines at the corners of his mouth she hadn't noticed before, not from smiling but from holding things in. He wasn't a man who offered easy words, but the ones he gave, she believed. "Come with me tomorrow," she said. "I need to trap the far ridge. We can be back by dusk. All right." She turned back to the stove and he didn't press for more. The next day they packed light. He carried the traps and she brought dried apples and a tin of salt. They rode out just after dawn, the horses picking their way through the wet brush. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the hills rolled out before them in quiet gold. By midday, they'd reached the ridge. She led him along the game trail, pointing out tracks, scat, the lean of branches pushed by something heavier than wind. He didn't speak much, but he moved like he understood the woods, like they spoke to him in a way she respected. She set the last trap beneath a fallen log, checking the tension twice before brushing the print of her boot from the soft ground. When she straightened, he was watching her. "What? You're good at this." "I had to be." "No, you chose to be." She let out a breath. "I don't know how to be soft with people, but I know how to see what's coming. I know when something's real." He stepped closer, not touching her, just waiting. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of cedar between them. "I'll stay as long as you want me," he said. "And if I want you to stay always, then I will." She looked down at the trap, at the way it was set, fair and clean, then back at him. "I want you to stay." He didn't move, not at first. Then he reached out, slow, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "All right." They rode back as the sun slipped behind the ridge. That night she didn't latch her door. He didn't wait long before stepping through it, and when he lay beside her, he didn't ask for anything but her hand. She gave it freely. The rain came steady through June, soaking the ground until the creek behind the barn overflowed in a wide, slow ribbon. The fields turned lush, wildflowers flecking the edges where the grass climbed high, and the days stretched long beneath thick skies. Josephine took to wearing her sleeves rolled halfway up, hair pinned in a knot low at her neck. Harlan had taken to building. He spent his mornings laying stone for a smokehouse, stacking each piece with exacting care, sweat sliding down his temples as he worked. She brought him water without asking and watched from the porch as he shaped something out of nothing, as if he'd always known how to make permanence with his hands. One evening, after the clouds had broken and the light turned soft across the valley, she stood just inside the barn, arms crossed, watching him hang the last set of hinges on the new door. "You've done more in 2 months than I managed in a year," she said. "I don't mind the work. You never ask for anything in return." He bent to gather his tools, pausing only when she stepped closer. "I don't know what to give a man like you," she said. "You don't ask, you don't push. I don't need much, I know." "That's the part that makes it harder." He straightened, the smell of cedar and iron dust clinging to his shirt. "I'm not here for what you can give me." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her, not with surprise, but with patience. "Because you're the only place that's ever felt like staying." She lowered her arms. "You say that like I couldn't still send you packing." He nodded. "You could." She reached up then, fingers brushing the collar of his shirt. "But I won't." That night they shelled peas by lantern light. Her hands moved slow, his steady beside her, and the rhythm filled the space between their words. Afterward they sat on the floor near the hearth, her back against the frame of his bent knee, his hand resting lightly along her arm. "I used to wonder what it would feel like to grow old alone," she said. "You won't," he answered. "How do you know?" "Because I'm not going anywhere." She turned her head to look at him, shadows flickering across his face. "But what if I'm not enough? You are." She didn't answer right away. Then her fingers curled around his. "There's a patch of land past the creek," she said, "flat enough for beans if we clear it. I'll start on it in the morning." She leaned into him then, her body finding its shape against his. No hesitation, no need for words. By midsummer, the smokehouse stood finished, the fence behind the barn lined tight with new boards, and her dress hung from a new peg he'd carved beside the hearth. His rifle leaned next to hers, his boots beside hers under the bed. One morning, she woke to the sound of him splitting kindling in the yard, the rhythm of it sure and familiar. She stood at the window, watching him move through the early light, and something in her chest settled. He had pulled her out of that river, shaking and frozen. But he hadn't just brought her back from the edge of the current, he'd stayed, and now she wasn't just breathing, she was living. By early August, the dry heat had settled deep into the valley, pulling the scent of resin from the pines and turning the dirt path to the creek into a line of pale dust. Josephine shaded her eyes as she stepped from the cabin, her apron damp at the waist where she'd wiped her hands after rinsing lentils. She scanned the far tree line, following the echo of hooves until Harlan came into view, leading the mule with 2 sacks slung over its back. She met him halfway to the barn. "You found barley?" Traded with a man coming in from the Judith Basin. He had more than he could carry and needed leather patches for his wagon tarp. She reached for one of the sacks, testing the weight. "We'll have enough to plant next spring." "That's the idea." They stored the grain in the small loft above the barn where the air stayed dry. She paused at the top of the ladder, glancing out through the slats of the loft window. "There's talk in town," she said. that the railroad might lay track past Willow Creek. He stepped up beside her, resting one hand on the beam above his head. That'd bring men, money, and trouble, likely. She looked at him, and something in his expression steadied her. Would you want to move closer to town? If the land here gets crowded? I didn't come for a crowd. She nodded once, and they descended together, the loft door creaking shut behind them. That evening, she sat on the porch mending the strap of her work glove while he cleaned the bridle leather. The air was thick with the hum of crickets. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she looked up to see a wagon cresting the lower trail, a woman at the reins, two children beside her. Josephine stood slowly. Harlan followed her gaze. "They're lost," she said. He set the bridle aside without speaking. By the time the wagon pulled to a stop near the pump, the woman's face was streaked with dust and her boy's lip was bleeding. "Beg pardon," the woman said, voice hoarse, "but we've been without water since midday. My husband broke his leg 3 days back. We're trying to make Helena, but I don't know that we will." Josephine stepped forward. "You'll stay the night. There's shade behind the barn and we've stew made." The woman hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." Harlan answered before Josephine could. "You aren't." They settled the family behind the barn, the children too tired to speak, the woman near tears when Josephine handed her a tin cup of cool water. Harlan brought out a cot from the shed, and Josephine gave the woman her only spare quilt without thinking twice. They didn't ask for stories. Didn't need to. By morning, the woman's hands had steadied, and her boy had smiled once when Josephine handed him a piece of dried apple. "You'll make it to Helena," Josephine said as they hitched their mule and wagon. "But rest another day if you need." The woman nodded. "Thank you, I don't forget kindness." After they rode off, Harlan turned to her. "You were her once." She didn't flinch. "And you were who she needed." He reached for her then, his hand warm at the back of her neck. "We built something here," she leaned into him. "It's ours now." That night, after the dishes were washed and the last of the twilight faded, she found him sitting at the edge of the porch, legs stretched out, hat in his hands. "You thinking about the railroad?" she asked. "I'm thinking about you." She sat beside him. "What about me? How I want to marry you." She looked at him, long and full. "You're sure?" "I've never been more." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Then say it plain." He turned to her, voice low. "Josephine Barnes, will you marry me?" "I will." They were wed by the traveling preacher who passed through once a season. She wore a dress of pale lavender, stitched from the bolt he'd brought months before. He'd shaved that morning, and she'd braided her hair with a strip of ribbon her father once tied around seed bundles. The preacher stood beneath the cottonwood in back, the same one that had seen their first quiet spring, the same one that had outlived floods and frost and the years between. There were no guests but the trees and the birds and the land that had held them both. When the words were spoken and the hands joined, Harlan pressed his lips to hers, not as a promise, but as a beginning. They spent that evening beneath the stars, a quilt spread on the grass, the sky wide above them. She lay with her head on his chest, listening to the rhythm of his breath, the steady thump of the heart that had never once turned away from her. "You still think about leaving?" she asked. "Only if you come with me." "I won't need to. Everything I want's here." They slept with the windows open, the scent of wild sage drifting on the air. His hand found hers beneath the quilt, fingers threaded, years passed. The barley grew tall and the smokehouse never sagged. They added a second room to the cabin, then a small porch off the back. She planted sunflowers along the fence and he carved the year they married into the doorframe. They never spoke of the river again. They didn't need to, because in the end it hadn't taken her. It had brought her to him. And he'd stayed, always.